All right, so I'll just do a quick introduction then. So we have Jihoon and Chris from the team at Quartz. They're out in New York. Built a couple sites on React using Apollo, which is a client-side cache for GraphQL, and then they're consuming GraphQL queries from WordPress running WPGraphQL plugin. So yeah, they're just here to present their stack. So I'm going to mute our end while they present, and then we'll open it up for question and answer after that.
All right, can you guys hear us? All right, thumbs up. I like it. And can you see the slides? All right. Okay, so thanks for coming out ahead of this holiday weekend. We're going to be talking about the new stack that we built. I think any story of a new stack starts with the old stack, so forgive me for going over that, hopefully briefly. I did want to intro this with something that we think about a lot at Quartz. This is a quote from our VP of Product. If you can Google that article, it's a great article. If you want to read it later. It covers our entire organization, but we have a way of interpreting it as well on the product development team. Quartz is a news organization, and its mission is to disseminate information to its readers. So when you say Quartz is an API on the product development team, we really think of that meaning that we should be building products that are open, and that the way that we build them enables you to build other things on top of them. So we really take that to heart when we're building products, and we really do think of Quartz itself as an API. So we're talking about the new QZ.com stack. I should point out right here that this stack is running two websites right now. One is work.qz.com, and the other is quartzy.qz.com. The original, our main website, qz.com, is still on the old stack that we'll talk about in a bit. So the first step in building a new stack is to talk about building it. It can't just be thinking about building it. It needs to be about talking about it, socializing it, and getting the conversations going within your team. That's the only way, in my opinion, that you can really fix some of the problems and challenges that you're going to encounter along the way, and hopefully mitigate some of those before you even get started. And then I think the next step is to pretend to build it. And that's something that we got an opportunity to do. Jihoon and I joined about a year and a half ago, about the same time. And right after Jihoon joined, we had been talking about building this new stack for a really long time. Jihoon got the opportunity to build a proof of concept. And so we built a React app that was consuming our existing API. And that was a really crucial step to understanding how we needed to approach this problem. But a lot of the time, even after you take those steps, you don't get to work on things right away. And that was certainly the case for us. We had a lot of competing priorities. We had a lot of new products that were shoved ahead of this work in the pipeline. And so after we did all of this work to really plan out how we would approach it, we just had to wait. But luckily, more often than not, an opportunity comes along, and that was our opportunity was our product team just committing to building these new websites, work.qz.com and quartzy.qz.com. And so initially, like the first idea from our product team was that we would build these additions on our current stack, and that we would migrate them over later when we finally had the time that we needed to build out this new stack as we conceived of it. But we sort of seized on the opportunity, and we realized that if we could build these new sites on the new stack, it would be a little bit more difficult because they wouldn't be fully integrated, but it was really the only path that we had in the next year to even start working on this. And then that led us to being able to start working on it. So we started working on Quartz at Work in July, and we launched that in October, and we started working on Quartzy immediately after Quartz at Work launched, and we were able to launch that in mid-November. And I think we are going to be saying the word "we" a lot in this presentation, and just wanted to point out that there's a very talented and dedicated team. At the height of development, there were 6 engineers working on this new platform. We have some very talented designers and product managers and project managers. Our VP of product engineering was instrumental in making all of this happen. So just wanted to point that out. So briefly going over what our current stack looks like. This is essentially the same stack that QZ.com launched on over 5 years ago. And it really took this concept of being an API to heart. So the very first thing that they built before they did anything at all was to build a custom REST API. This was before the WordPress REST API was really even being talked about seriously. So at the time, it was a very innovative approach to creating a news website. So we built out a custom REST API with routes that corresponded to the pages that they wanted to build. And underpinning that was this article data model. It was really just a single sort of monolithic class. And you'll see how that interconnected with some other things. The next thing that they built was a backbone JS app with routes and controllers and views and templates and an app that consumed that REST API. And once they had done that, they realized that server-side rendering was pretty important to them. And so what they did was they built parallel code in WordPress that used that same data model and API code that generated article data to basically render the same thing server-side and client-side, so that you would get a server-side render. The article data would be bootstrapped into the page, into a browser global. The Backbone app would pick that up and re-render the same thing and attach to the existing DOM elements. And then you would have a reactive app where users could click around and see things render almost immediately. One drawback to that became pretty quick is that these were both like 2 monolithic apps that you have to develop in parallel. And I just added this to note that particular pain point with the CSS bundle just becoming incredibly unwieldy and large over time. So pain points, when I joined and Jihoon joined, these were already pretty obvious. The fact that we have 2 separate apps doing the same thing, I mean, you have to double code every new feature, every new project, everything. And the next pain point is the same thing, because it's really just hard to overstate how painful this was for our development team. Another thing that goes into that is really lengthy conversations about the data model before you can even start work, because anytime you're building something new out, you have to change that underpinning article data model class. And that has a lot of ramifications across the entire app. So that really took up a big chunk of time before you could even get started. And even when you took the time to do that and did it very carefully, there were always mistakes that necessitated some additional work. Coordinating deploys between these 2 linked apps was also sort of painful. We're on WordPress VIP and we don't always control the timing of our deploys. And since we need to have correspondence between what the server renders and what the client renders, we had to time those correctly. And so there was a whole elaborate system to make that possible. I talked a little bit about bundle sizes already, but it was definitely a pain point. And that CSS in particular, we sort of grew afraid to change certain parts of it because we knew that we were almost guaranteed to introduce regressions. So we started working on a new plan, a new architecture for this new stack to address those pain points. We decided that we wanted to treat WordPress as a headless CMS and just strictly as an API. And basically address that pain point of double coding so that we created just one set of templates, one set of views for our website. So the first thing we looked at was the REST API was gaining a lot of traction, and it seemed we could draw a lot of parallels between it and our custom REST API, and it looked like a good tool for the job. And so we sort of decided that we could re-implement our custom API with something that was going to be supported and robust. And then we knew we wanted to build a React app, and we just sort of assumed that we would build like a custom data fetch layer to fetch data from that API, maybe cache it somehow. We'll figure that out later. And then we really were sort of anxious about performance on the application side. So we sketched out a lot of plans to cache all of our network requests, and basically anything that was happening, we were very concerned about caching it for performance reasons. And so this is about the time where that hourglass was in the previous slide, where we didn't have the opportunity to work on it, and it's kind of sat around. And then it helped us think about what our actual pain points were and not what we thought our pain points were. And we really were asking ourselves the question of where our technical debt was really accumulating. And the answers to that were inconsistency in data models. Even though we spent a ton of time talking about it, we were just constantly creating inconsistency in our data models. And more to the point, we were creating these bespoke single-use endpoints. So we would have an endpoint for each edition of our homepage. We had 3 editions for global, India, and Africa. We'd have an endpoint for popular posts and latest posts, and they weren't consistent in the way that they went about implementing our data model. There was no validation of the data types. We were constantly overfetching because we were stuffing everything that we needed into our article data model. So anytime that we were building on a new page, we were getting way more data than we need. And because of that, we really didn't understand what data we needed. So there was really no way to understand what our API was doing and how our app was consuming it. So that led us to our second attempt. And this was around the time that I had met Jason Ball at a WordPress VIP event where he had presented on WPGraphQL, sort of started to understand the advantages of that architecture and how it really addressed our actual pain points as we had thought about them. And the biggest revelation, I think, there was to let not just the application, but the component, and specifically a React component, define its own data model for what it needed to render without worrying about conflicts with other components or anything else really at all. And the second thing that we sort of realized is that we were worrying extremely prematurely about caching, and we should really just set about building this thing. And if we had problems, then we could address them. And if we wanted to worry about performance, we should really be worrying about client performance. So this led us to the new stack. And as you can see, that code that was on the previous slide is still there, and it's still running right now, powering qz.com. So we couldn't do anything that would interfere or conflict with that. But luckily, WPGraphQL is a pretty easy drop-in. It's a plugin. It's been reviewed by VIP, so it was easy to work with them to get it deployed. And the bulk of the work was really just in extending the default WP GraphQL schema. And that's super easy to do with the hooks that are provided. We've written about 2,000 lines of code. Basically, we are exposing our custom post types. We're exposing our post meta that we need to render our article pages. We're allowing tax queries. We looked at, and I think we're initially using a plugin that basically provides a way to map GraphQL queries to WP query tax queries. But we realized that that didn't provide the structure that would help us benefit from this plugin. So we created custom queries that allowed us to define what we actually wanted to do. So instead of implementing something like a taxonomy archive page via a tax query, we would really define what that tax archive page was doing and craft a query that spoke directly to that. And I think that makes a lot of sense because you're sort of semantically defining what you want that query to do. And so it's very declarative. It makes a lot of sense and it's easy to understand. We also had a couple plugin integrations that we did, most importantly with Co-Authors Plus. And that was very straightforward. Basically, Co-Authors Plus at its core is a custom taxonomy and a custom post type. So once you understand how to wire those up to GraphQL, it's fairly straightforward to do. The last thing we needed to worry about was security. Our custom REST API has always been public, and I think a public API that doesn't require any authentication at all is very important. It allows experimentation, it allows people to play with your product. And so we wanted to do that. So we worked with VIP to figure out ways where we could disable some things that they saw as dangerous, so that we could keep this endpoint open to all. And also, honestly, not implementing authentication kind of was save some time for us. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Jihoon now to talk about the React app that we built on top of Stack.
Yeah, so our stack essentially just in the client side consists of React and Apollo. So at the bottom you see, we'll blow it up. So this is essentially what we call a Modular Quartz, which essentially is just a page on our website. So it consists of like a component, like the JSX file, which imports its own style, its own CSS file. And with the addition of Apollo, it allows you to import its own GraphQL query. And as well as we use Jest at Quartz. So we have our own tests and we have their own snapshot tests. That's all encapsulated in this one folder, which, it's just React is really good about separation of concern. And we figured that there's tons of different ways of styling your React applications, but this was what we thought was the best way of making our app more modular. But in terms of the actual building process of the client application, the biggest problem that biggest question that we came across over and over again was trying to strike a balance between control and simplicity. What I mean by that is making the decision between trying to code things on your own versus using a separate library that abstracts away a lot of the logic. And Webpack was one instance where we came across that problem. And I don't know if you guys have a lot of experience with Webpack, but to me, it's just this black box that offers a ton of magic features. It takes a while to understand. I'm still trying to grasp every little details of it. So when we're building, we thought it'd be best to kind of make our own configurations to really understand the nuances of all the Webpack has to offer. And these are some of the features that we're trying to implement at first. So hot module placement during development, server-side rendering, as well as code splitting. So essentially asynchronous routes. We decided to forego code splitting to reduce the complexity of the app because we were kind of working under little stringent deadlines. But we ended up implementing both hot module, HMR, and SSR. So we came up with 4 separate configurations for dev and production, depending on whether you're working with client or server. And all 4 of these extend from its own base configuration. And without getting too much into the weeds of what these configurations look like, I'll just briefly do an overview. So the client dev configuration, the bundle is held in memory and serves from an instance of a Webpack dev server, whereas a server dev configuration is polling uses polling to update the server bundle whenever there's a change, as well as for updating stale bundles during hard refreshes. And in the the production side of things, both the client and server configurations, there's nothing too special other than just a few optimizations like buckifying and minifying, and extracting any kind of CSS files there is. But much of the complications that we experienced trying to set up our own Webpack configurations can now be avoided probably using a service like Create React App, which wasn't as mature as we would have liked during the planning phase. Yeah. But a separate technology where we came across the same question of control versus simplicity was Apollo, where we kind of opted to go for the latter in this case, opted to go for the simplicity route. So when we're trying to pick a good GraphQL client, we're deciding between Apollo and Relay. And Relay, in this case, we're talking about Relay 1.0 or Relay Classic and not Relay Modern, because that was just being released while we were planning out the architecture of the client app. So the reason why we decided not to go with Relay was that it was much easier to get started with Apollo than with Relay Classic. So Relay it's very big. It's 3 times the size of Apollo. There was really poor documentation, and the ecosystem was very much siloed from the rest of the open source community, I felt. And also it was much more opinionated on how to actually manage your state. So it made this implicit assumption that the application state and in turn the component state are all going to be managed by Relay. And we were used to using Redux to manage our application state. And since Apollo, at least 1.0, was built on top of Redux, the fact that we can continue to reuse Redux and manage the rest of the application state aside from what we're fetching from the API was a huge plus for us. Also, Apollo offered a lot of these features that we're trying to implement out of the box, like server-side rendering. They provide like a couple functions that you just have to, invoke on the server, and it just magically works, which is great. But the fact that it abstracts away a lot of the complicated logic was also its biggest downside, because you just lost a lot of control over how to actually do these querying. So before I talk about that, if you look on the actual code here, this is just what Apollo, if you've never taken a look at it, this is how you would set up like Apollo wrapped component. So you see that there's a GraphQL component, and all you're specifying is what query to actually fetch and the options for that query, how to process the data that gets come back. And all you're doing is wrapping that around a presentational component that's going to receive all the props that it needs, all the data that it needs to render. So it's really simple to use, and it's really simple to set up. But the downside of this setup is that the query logic is incredibly tightly coupled to the wrapping component, to the higher order component. So for better or worse, it becomes more difficult to think of data as a separate entity from its associated component. So the way that I think about any application is that the state is stored in a single source of truth. So like in the case of Redux, there's a single store where you are slicing and dicing all of the application state and distributing it to the components that need the data. But for Apollo, because each component is so strictly tied to a single query, and in turn it's specifically tied to a specific piece of data, if there's any significant overlap between the pieces of data that your components need, then it's much harder to access other parts of the state. So that was one downside of that. The other downside was the fact that because a lot of the logic is abstracted away from your control, if there was any kind of bug that arose, it was much harder to debug. So some of the challenges that
Oh yeah, you can jump in a little bit. So here are some of the things that we sort of encountered along the way, and we're trying to limit these. Obviously, I'm a bug writing machine, but I'm trying to limit these to the high-level problems that someone who's attempting the same kind of thing might encounter. So server-side rendering comes with its own sort of bundle of challenges. One thing, well, actually, let's talk about what you were just talking about with the difficulty of making sure that the server-side render matches the client-side render. Was that where you're going? Okay. Okay, so server-side rendering, we're using Express, and when you create a new sort of instance of the application as part of the request lifecycle, it's really crucial to make sure that you generate new instances of anything that holds state. So your Redux store, your Apollo client, or any sort of configuration object that might get mutated as part of the application process. Because if you don't do that sort of inside the closure that defines your app middleware, then you're going to run into a ton of problems that are incredibly hard to debug because you won't understand why this thing that you think is getting created fresh each time isn't. Saving state and hydrating without mismatches. The approach to client-side rendering or server-side rendering and matching up with a client-side render is pretty similar to what we had before, where we have like a browser global that holds the initial state for Apollo, and it gets injected into the store, and then the Apollo and React hydrate the application. Making sure that you do the same thing on your server-side render and client-side render is really crucial. And again, if you have problems there, it's going to be really hard to figure out what's going on. Caching and remembering error states. This one was a real challenge for us. So say you are querying for an article and it doesn't exist, or it returns some response that you're not prepared to handle. And in the application, you're throwing an exception that ends up not being caught. It turns out that either an architecture decision or bug in Apollo is such that if there's a GraphQL error, if there's an error in the actual query and you get a 500 response from your GraphQL server, then there's going to be an uncaught exception and your user is going to see an extremely ugly error message. So this was like a very critical thing that we had to work around. And our workaround was basically to try to render the application, catch an exception if it happened, and then connect our app middleware to Redux and let the application know that the route that we just tried to render will result in an error. And then we re-render the entire application, and we get the error, a nice looking error page that we want. The alternative to that is basically to have one generic error page for your entire application for every single error. And then now you have this sort of side piece of HTML that you have to keep up to date style-wise. So that's sort of a tricky thing that Apollo doesn't make very easy. That's the GitHub issue that sort of talks about that issue that I was just talking about. Preventing query refetches. We also had an issue where you sometimes when you are rehydrating the app, it wasn't able to tell that the instance of data returned from a query was the same as the data that it had in that initial state. So we would actually get a double render when we went to hydrate the app and render it client side. That's something to watch out for. And then page load optimization. We were paying a lot of attention to our bundle size, and React is big, but it was certainly a manageable number. We were happy with it, and then we went to go measure our performance with Google PageSpeed and Lighthouse, and we realized that it really wasn't as fast as we thought it was going to be. And we realized that we weren't paying attention at all to the size of that bootstrapped initial state. So on our article page, we have the text of the article, obviously, and then we have a research module with a lot of articles in it. We were rendering that server side because we thought that would be good for SEO, but that ended up contributing to like a huge chunk of bootstrapped initial state, and just parsing that JSON was contributing to a huge blip in performance. So Jihoon actually did a lot of work to make those queries async, which then reduced the boot up time of the app and made things a lot more performant. WPGraphQL Security, I already talked about that a little bit, but it's not quite done. We ended up implementing a query whitelist. So we would take the queries that were in our application, and we would use the tool called persist GraphQL to extract those queries. So now we had like a JSON representation of all the possible queries that were in our app. And then we would give that to WordPress VIP and say that here are the queries that we want to allow. And that was our method of eliminating any queries that would be dangerous. We're basically saying only allow these queries. That's really not anywhere near as open as we'd like our API to be. So that's one that we're still working on. We're still working with VIP to make that a little bit more flexible. Couple of helping hands that speak to the balance that Jihoon was talking about between complexity or simplicity and customization. React Helmet is what we went with for managing the tags in our document head, meta and style and things like that. This tool worked really well as long as you follow their directions exactly, which I wasn't very good about doing. But if you do that, we find that it's a pretty reliable tool and can basically do just about anything that you need it to do. One word of warning on two-component. There is a way to get components out of React Helmet if you're not ready to render to string just yet. But we tried to do that, and it caused a lot of headaches. So I would stick with render to string. And then also from NFL, the React GPT for ad delivery. Our implementing ads on our site was a huge part of this project and a high-profile one, and it's very complicated. And this was able to handle all of our very diverse use cases and really saved a lot of time. If we had to implement our own library, we'd probably still be working on it. The only thing to be aware there is the size of this module. It contributes to a big chunk of our bundle. Challenges to come, we're moving things under a single roof. So these two properties that we've built out, we want to put QZ.com on this platform. So basically, one of the advantages of this platform is code reuse. We can use a single article component and make it look different depending on the context. So that means that's sort of a challenge because you have to be able to make a single component style itself differently. And we have some ideas about that, but it looks like it's going to be a big undertaking. Code splitting. Do you want to speak a little bit about what we have planned there?
There's not much other than that we're trying to get asynchronous routing to work.
I mean, that's pretty critical for client-side performance as we grow our code base.
Right.
A/B testing, and we are going to circle back to some of the caching things that we've sort of avoided working on thus far. And we're happy with our performance. And when you stack it up against our legacy stack, the performance looks awesome. But we're not happy. We know we can squeeze more out of this platform, and we need to keep working on that. tools like Lighthouse and PW Metrics have been really, really helpful in highlighting areas where we need to improve. And then there's a new version of Apollo out that is more modular, but it's not a simple migration process. So we're still taking a look at Apollo 2.0, and right now we're still on 1.4. I know that was a little bit breakneck, but would love to hear any questions that anyone has. I'm going to mute our side so that that can come through.
All right. Oh, yeah, thanks for going over that. I'll start with one question. Could you pull up the sites that you built so we could see them and maybe show like Apollo DevTools in the browser?
Do you have Apollo DevTools in your browser, Jihoon? I don't have it on this laptop.
I do then. I can pull it up.
Oh, great. Work.qz.com is one of them.
Let's see. All right, so I'll pull it up over here. Let's see. Woo. All right. All right, so yeah, since it's so we got Redux DevTools, React DevTools, and Apollo DevTools. So their site has a like you can click to change routes or whatever, and then in Apollo DevTools, you can see the queries that a page is monitoring to build the content, right? So yeah, Apollo DevTools gives you all this. Let's see. That's what happens when you run ads on your site, right? No, let's see. Yeah, so you can click into like any individual query, get details on the query that was ran to get that data, and then you can even run it in GraphQL right here to see the data that's coming back. And then you can monitor all the queries like for any given route. And as I change routes, you see the different queries that are run. Mutations would be the same if they used it. And then like the global store too, you can see all the stuff in your client-side cache. So it's pretty cool. Just wanted to point that out. Any other? I'm sure we got lots of questions.
Yeah, I got a question. Where's your biggest bottleneck coming from?
Could you repeat that?
So I'll repeat that just to make sure it's clear. So the question was just asking what your biggest bottleneck is in the stack, and yeah.
Can you hear us still?
Yeah.
Yes.
Performance, like performance bottleneck, like payment bottleneck.
What?
Are you performance bottleneck?
Yeah. Like, what's your ultimate page optimization? Like, where do you try to get your next?
Yeah. So if you didn't hear, it was what's the biggest performance bottleneck? What would you focus on next to optimize? And like, what's your goal for optimization? I guess.
Sure. Main thing is our client-side boot up time. So we have a nice service manager that is we have a very short time to first byte and time to first paint. But then we have to boot up that client-side React app and re-render everything. And we got into that a little bit before with like having too big of an initial state bundle, and you're looking at the timeline in Chrome DevTools and you see like that's where we're spending seconds. So really optimizing that boot up process has been a challenge. That means making more queries async. It means keeping an eye on our bundle size to make sure that that parsing that JavaScript isn't taking a ton of time, and sort of looking at potential code splitting so that you're really only worrying about part of the page, a critical path and things like that.
Cool, thanks. All right, got another question.
In terms of code splitting, could you put a thought at a high level how you typically sort of in relation to WordPress?
So the question, if you didn't hear, was could you talk more about code splitting, how you manage that, and specifically in terms of the WordPress architecture?
Wait, in terms. In terms of what? Sorry.
So yeah, so how do you manage code splitting, and if there is anything specific to how it ties into WordPress, can you talk about that as well?
Code splitting, like all we're doing right now is extracting out the bundles or like the vendor bundles. There isn't anything going on right now in terms of code splitting between routes. That's what we're going to be working on next. I'm not exactly sure if there's any WordPress side to that.
No, that's pretty much, yeah, that's all on the React side. We're still pretty early in that. We're looking at a plugin called React Loadable. When you have code splitting on the server side, it really becomes incredibly complicated because you need basically to be able to serve up the code that they need to render the current page, plus the rest of the code, right? And so it kind of becomes this weird, like this branching tree where you're trying to provide just enough and then have like something for everything everything else that's needed, like ready to go. But we started walking down that path by implementing it ourselves, but it seems like looking at a library might be the way to go on this, but we're still looking at it.
So I think one thing too regarding like code splitting, I think one thing that may not have been fully like talked about is like WordPress does no view rendering anymore. So everything is 100% rendered from JavaScript. So that like there's not a WordPress theme that renders first and then JavaScript takes over. So WordPress is just providing data. So like the code splitting they're talking about is just Node and React, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, apologies if that wasn't clear. One of the things we're really, really looking forward to is deleting, 5 years worth of legacy WordPress code that I really can't even stand to look at anymore. So that's like my payoff, the light at the end of the tunnel for this project.
Yeah.
So I'm still fairly into the GraphQL world, and I've been curious to know, does GraphQL make you rethink how you go about building your database as well as your model itself? You kind of look at what your client specifically needs data-wise and kind of help describe how that model can go and get that back.
Could you guys hear that okay? Or, okay, I'll repeat. So does he said he's new to GraphQL, so he's curious if working with GraphQL has made you rethink your underlying data store, like and how you store your models and stuff like that. Is that?
Yeah, pretty much. Like, do you think about what your client needs specifically in terms of data first, and then kind of go about building your models, or do you just go in and start building up the database and models and figure out what it works?
Yeah, so yeah, basically he's asking, do you basically figure out what your client needs to look like first and then figure out the data that needs to store it, or do you still build out a database and then figure out how to get that to the client?
Sure. Well, this is our first project using GraphQL, and we're using WPGraphQL, so a lot of, like, that base schema, those base data models basically are already there. We're sort of building on top of them, providing that we're storing in post meta and taxonomies and things like that. So that makes it a lot easier for us. We can basically the great work that Jason and others have done with that plugin. What that does free us up to do is basically we do define the data that we need on the client side, and that's like one of the big advantages of GraphQL. We really have to think about how that's organized. We basically just need to know if it's there or not. And if it's not there, then we go into WPGraphQL and extend that schema to provide it. The sort of architecture is already there, if that makes sense.
There is talks.
Does
like,
that answer your question, or did I sort of talk around it a little bit?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, he says thanks. I'll speak to that a little bit. GraphQL Summit. They post all their videos. It was back in October. There's some talks there, and just on their channel and Apollo's channel on YouTube in general that talk about like schema first design, like GraphQL. They're an open source, whatever. Yeah, so they have some talks too as well about schema first design, right? Like coming up with what your needs are, and then the client folks can go build what they need, and then the backend can go build what they need. I think it's different when you're coming from a brand new like project versus like something like they have a defined schema, like backend architecture already. So they kind of have to mold it on that.
Can you talk briefly about the security?
Okay, yeah. So they said you briefly mentioned security, but didn't really talk about it after you started talking about Apollo. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about security?
Sure. So like we talked about, we really want to keep our API public, and if we're using GraphQL as that public API, then there's a lot of things that it can do out of the box that we really just can't support at all. Obviously, mutations are just out of the question. We can't have that really be available if we're not going to implement authentication. So that's something that right off the bat I'm just unsetting on the schema, like no mutations. What I'm doing right now is I'm working with WordPress VIP to sort of define some contours of what makes an acceptable and performant query. GraphQL is mostly mapping what it does onto WP query. And those guys have a really, really good understanding of what constitutes a performant and non-performant WP query. So that makes it a little bit easier to try to figure out where we need to be. So instead of really thinking about GraphQL queries, I'm really thinking about WP queries that WP GraphQL maps to. So the latest thing that I'm working with them on is the underlying GraphQL library that WP GraphQL uses has a concept of query cost. So they provide some hooks to let you basically define what you think a query costs in terms of performance. So I can basically get a object representation of that query, and I can say, oh, there's a where clause on here. That probably is going to make it more expensive than just a query without a where clause. And then I can go a little bit further and take a look at what's inside of that where clause and say, okay, this where clause has some queries that we've defined, and we know that those are good where clauses or performant where clauses. But it also has this not in where clause or something that maps to a not in, and we know that that's not going to be very performant. So we can give that a high cost. We can even give it an exorbitant cost, so that like we can give it 1,000,000 points. And now we know that that query is never going to pass muster. And so basically, it's another form of whitelist, but you're whitelisting at a granular level. what sort of queries or query arguments you're going to allow. And so we're basically, I've written some code where we're going to be shooting for a query cost of 0. Any sort of whitelisted query arg that we know is going to be performant, we give that a cost of 0. Everything else gets a cost of 1,000, but it doesn't really matter. Even if it's 1, it's not going to be allowed. And so WordPress VIP is still looking at that. I think that we're going to refine it a little bit, but I think that's basically the approach that we're going to take to keep a public API without authentication.
So in regards to query complexity, since you can do like deeply nested queries too, like I could ask for posts and then categories and then posts of those categories and then categories of those posts and then posts of like, have you factored in how query complexity would work with that? Like allow users to query for posts 1 level or 2 levels deep, but once it gets to a certain point, it gets too complex, or?
Yeah, so there's another query depth restriction that you can add via that library. We're probably getting a little bit lucky here, but we don't have any need to implement nested queries beyond, I think, 2 levels. So that's a pretty easy cutoff for us to take. We can just say anything with more than 2 levels, not allowed.
Yeah, one more.
Is there any GraphQL news that you're excited about? Not necessarily related to the project, but just in general.
So the question was, is there any GraphQL news you're excited about? Not specifically about your project, but just in general.
I mean, I think that's basically a way of saying that maybe our needs are somewhat basic right now, but GraphQL or WPGraphQL's implementation is really solved for everything that we need to extract from WordPress right now. I don't think we're doing anything that's too crazy in WordPress. Like I said before, we have custom post types and custom taxonomies like anyone else. But I think as long as you manage how you use WordPress and do things in relatively normal ways, then WP GraphQL is certainly going to serve you well. And yeah, it's worked out pretty well for us.
I'm familiar with Schema. I am curious how the user would administer titles, description, that are using fields or something like that in WordPress.
So the question was, how do you use React Helmet to manage like your meta descriptions, and how do you tie in to get like WordPress data for that?
Right. I think our use is pretty straightforward. Like if you're not familiar with React Helmet, it's basically allows you to define meta tags inside of any component at all, and those will get hoisted up and set on the document head, which is otherwise outside of the scope of the React app. So behind the scenes, it's just using some very basic DOM manipulation to get at document head, but it's allowing you to define those tags inside of React components. So all we're doing really is when we get the data back from GraphQL, it defines some pieces of metadata that we're interested in, and we're able to just very cleanly render those into a meta tag inside of that helmet component. And then that just gets hoisted right up, and it replaces any tag that was already there, and it manages all of that for you. So it's really a success story for that component. It's very easy to use, and I can't really think of a use case where that it would be problematic. I mean, if anything, it's really, it goes back to what Jihoon was talking about, where your queries and your data layer is very tightly coupled to your component. So if you had the need to query some other piece of data in order to render a meta tag or a tag that needed to go into the head, and you were using Apollo, you might run into some trouble because you wouldn't have that at your disposal. But as long as everything that you need to render that page or that component comes back from your GraphQL query, or can be on hand in a config object or something like that, you're pretty much set to go.
Are you guys still using Apollo 1.0, or have you migrated to 2.0?
Wait, Apollo 2.0, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. The question was, have you migrated to Apollo 2.0, or are you still on 1 point something? Oh. All right.
Hey, Siri.
Oh, there we go. So can you hear us?
Can you still hear us?
Yeah.
Can you hear us? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can tell you that I tried to upgrade to Apollo 2.0 just on my local, and it exploded pretty quickly. There's some good migration docs on there that I tried to follow, but that was just me tinkering around on an afternoon, and I didn't have time to pursue the actual problem there. So short answer is, unless you've solved this and I don't know about it, no. We haven't really spent the time we need to like evaluate Apollo 2.0. I know that it separates out the store, so it no longer uses, like, has Redux as a dependency. But we're pretty invested in Redux anyway, so it's not like we're jumping at the chance to like carve out Redux or anything like that. So definitely something that we want to do, but not something that we're, itching to make trouble for ourselves to do. How about you, Jason? Have you undertaken that?
Yeah, we have a small project that's on 2.0, but it's a really small project. Cool. Anybody else, or we can let you guys go, I think. Cool, yeah, thanks for your time. Of course.
All right, thanks, guys. Have a great holiday. Yeah, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. See ya.